But when our lives are in the hands of Jesus, he has this way of turning pain into purpose. He has this way of turning a mess into a miracle. And in church and in this series, even about finances, I've come to discover that my finances, as Sean talked about last week, when I tithe, it leaves my hands and ends up in the hands of Jesus. And what I've come to understand, that once I give, I can do way more with less in my hands and more that are in the hands of Jesus. I've also come to understand that in my finances, in the things of my resources, when my resources are in my hands, it can end up in debt. It can not end up in debt. It can end up in success. But what it doesn't end up in is in purpose. And when my life and my resources and my heart and my mind are in the hands of my Creator, it's like Jimmy flushing a 7-iron right down the middle to 15 feet from the pin. Pastor, what are you talking about today? Well, when I look at this passage of scripture here in John chapter 6, in this miracle of feeding the 5,000, I realize that these 2 fish and 5 pieces of bread, it passed through a lot of people's hands. If it was in the boy, let's start here. Before it was in the boy's hand, it was probably in his mom's hand who prepared his lunch. Come on, somebody. And then it was in his hands. And then it ended up in the disciples' hands. And then it ended up in Jesus' hands. And then it ended up back in the disciples' hands. And then it winded up in the hands of the hungry. But as I look through scripture, I realize that God uses ordinary people to do extraordinary things. It all depends on whose life our hands are in. That whatever you take from your hands and put in the hands of Jesus, and Jesus then puts it into the vision and the mission of this church, it's gonna change lives. It starts in my hands. It goes in the hands of Jesus. It goes into the hands of the disciples of our church. And then, lastly, but not least, it ends up in the hands of the hungry. Guys, when I looked at this, I realized something. These 20,000 people, they didn't follow Jesus because they were hungry. They followed Jesus because they were hurting. And what that says to me is Jesus wants us to meet practical needs. And when we meet the practical needs of the city, Jesus will meet the supernatural needs of their hearts. It's absolutely amazing. This kingdom thing, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense, but it changed lives. I am a living, breathing, walking, talking testimony of what God can do when you trust him with your resources. You know what that boy did? He was poor, but he trusted God.